They built an empire with blood and brilliance, warriors, engineers, tyrants. From the ashes of Sumer, Akkad rose, a people who would dominate the ancient world. But how did they rise so high and fall so hard? Stay close, because I'll tell you what happened. The story of Assyria begins, not in a palace, but in a humble trade city along the Tigris River. Around 2500 BCE, Ashur was a modest settlement. Its mud-brick buildings clustered along the riverbank like a collection of weathered stones. The city's name would eventually become synonymous with one of history's most feared empires. But in those early days, it was simply another trading post in the vast network of Mesopotamian commerce. The geography of Ashur was both blessing and curse. Positioned strategically along the Tigris, it commanded vital trade routes between the mountains of Anatolia and the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia. Merchants carrying precious metals, timber, and textiles would stop here to rest, trade, and resupply. Yet this same strategic position made Ashur vulnerable to the ambitions of larger powers. The city existed in the shadow of greater civilization Sumer to the south, Akkad to the southeast, and various Hurrian kingdoms to the north and west. But over centuries, Ashur grew, slowly, strategically, while Sumer and Babylon flourished to the south with their grand ziggurats and sophisticated legal codes. Assyria waited, watched, and learned. The early Assyrians were pragmatists above all else. They observed the rise and fall of their neighbors, studying their military tactics, administrative systems, and diplomatic strategies. They absorbed influences from the Sumerians' cuneiform writing system, the Akkadians' imperial ambitions, and the Hurrians' military innovations. The transformation from trading city to regional power didn't happen overnight. For nearly a millennium, Ashur remained relatively modest in its ambitions. The city-state engaged in typical Mesopotamian politics, forming alliances, paying tribute to stronger neighbors when necessary, and gradually expanding its influence through trade networks rather than conquest. The early Assyrian kings were as much merchants as they were rulers, understanding that economic power often preceded military dominance. By 1800 BCE, kings like Shamshi-Adad began shaping Assyria into something more formidable. Shamshi-Adad was a visionary who understood that Assyria's future lay not in remaining a passive trading hub, but in actively controlling the trade routes that had made it prosperous. He expanded Assyrian territory northward and westward, establishing a network of vassal cities and client states that would serve as the foundation for future imperial expansion. Shamshi-Adad's reign marked the first time Assyria truly flexed its military muscles. He reorganized the army, introducing new weapons and tactics borrowed from various neighbors, but adapted to Assyrian needs. More importantly, he established the principle that would define Assyrian policy for centuries to come, that security and prosperity were inseparable, and that both required the projection of power beyond one's immediate borders. The king also understood the importance of legitimacy in the ancient world. He claimed descent from Sargon of Akkad, linking his dynasty to one of Mesopotamia's most legendary conquerors. This wasn't merely propaganda, it was a statement of intent. Shamshi-Adad was declaring that Assyria would no longer be content to exist in the shadows of greater powers. It would become a great power itself. But it wasn't until the 14th century BCE that Assyria truly ascended to imperial status. The collapse of the Mitanni kingdom to the north, and the temporary weakness of both Egypt and Babylon, created a power vacuum that ambitious Assyrian kings were quick to fill. Under rulers like Ashur, Assyria began to assert itself as an equal to the great powers of the age, demanding recognition and respect from pharaohs and Babylonian kings alike. This period saw the development of what would become the Assyrian imperial model, a combination of military might, administrative efficiency, and psychological warfare that would terrorize the ancient world for centuries. The Assyrians learned that fear could be as effective as force, and that the reputation for brutality could often accomplish what armies alone could not. The rise of Assyria was not inevitable, but it was methodical. Each generation of kings built upon the achievements of their predecessors, gradually expanding territory, refining military tactics, and developing the administrative systems necessary to govern an empire. By the time the great conquering kings of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE took the throne, they inherited not just a kingdom, but a war machine that had been centuries in the making. The Assyrians weren't just soldiers, they redefined warfare itself. When other armies still relied heavily on bronze weapons and traditional tactics, the Assyrians embraced innovation with the fervor of revolutionaries. They understood that military superiority wasn't just about having more men or better training, though they excelled at both. It was about technological advancement, tactical flexibility, and the willingness to adapt and evolve faster than one's enemies. The mastery of iron weapons gave the Assyrians a decisive edge over their bronze-wielding opponents. Iron was harder, held a sharper edge longer, and was more readily available than the tin required for bronze production. But the Assyrians didn't simply adopt iron weapons, they perfected them. Their smiths developed techniques for creating superior iron alloys, producing swords, spearheads, and arrowheads that could cut through bronze armor like cloth. More importantly, they could equip larger armies with these superior weapons, giving them both qualitative and quantitative advantages over their enemies. The Assyrian military machine was built around professional soldiers rather than seasonal. While most ancient armies were composed primarily of farmers who fought during certain seasons and returned to their fields, the Assyrians maintained a core of full-time warriors who trained. These professional soldiers formed the backbone of Assyrian military might, providing the discipline, skill, and experience necessary for complex military operations. But perhaps the Assyrians' greatest innovation was in siege warfare. Ancient cities were typically protected by massive walls that could withstand traditional assault methods for months, or even years. The Assyrians revolutionized siegecraft by developing sophisticated siege engines that could breach even the strongest fortifications. Their battering rams were massive constructions protected by metal plates and operated by teams of soldiers working in coordination. They built siege towers that could match the height of city walls, allowing their archers to rain arrows down on defenders, while assault troops climbed to attack the ramparts directly. The Assyrians also pioneered the use of siege ramps, massive earthwork constructions that allowed their forces to literally walk up and over enemy walls. These ramps required enormous amounts of labor and materials, but they were devastatingly effective. The psychological impact of watching an enemy army build a mountain of earth that would inevitably lead to the city's fall was often as demoralizing as the physical threat itself. Under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Assyria crushed enemies with brutal efficiency that became legendary throughout the ancient world. Tiglath-Pileser III, who ruled from 744 to 727 BCE, transformed Assyria from a regional power into a true empire. He reorganized the army into specialized units, created a professional officer corps, and developed the logistic systems necessary to support large-scale, long-distance military campaigns. Tiglath-Pileser's military reforms were comprehensive and revolutionary. He divided his army into specialized units: heavy infantry armed with iron weapons and bronze armor, light infantry equipped with bows and slings, cavalry units mounted on horses rather than the traditional donkeys, and engineering corps responsible for siege operations. Each unit was trained for specific roles and could operate independently or in coordination with others. giving Assyrian commanders unprecedented tactical flexibility. The king also revolutionized military logistics, understanding that armies could only be as effective as their supply lines allowed. He established a network of supply depots throughout Assyrian territory, stockpiled weapons and provisions at strategic locations, and developed systems for rapidly moving supplies to armies in the field. This logistical sophistication allowed Assyrian forces to campaign far from home for extended periods, something that had been impossible for earlier armies. Sargon II, who ruled from 722 to 705 BCE, continued and expanded upon these innovations. His armies were instruments of precision as much as power, capable of adapting their tactics to different enemies and terrain. Against the mobile horse archers of the northern steppes, they employed different strategies than they used against the heavily fortified cities of the Levant or the chariot armies of Egypt. The Assyrian approach to warfare was holistic, encompassing not just the battle itself, but everything that led up to it and followed from it. They were masters of intelligence gathering, using networks of spies, merchants, and diplomats to learn about enemy strengths, weaknesses, and intentions long before armies marched. They understood that information was as valuable as weapons, and they invested heavily in acquiring it. Cities that resisted Assyrian demands were leveled with methodical. The Assyrians didn't simply conquer, they obliterated. Walls were torn down, stone by stone, buildings were burned, and the very foundations were sometimes dug up and scattered. This wasn't mere vindictiveness. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to discourage resistance in other cities. Populations that opposed Assyrian rule faced deportation on a massive scale. Entire peoples were uprooted from their ancestral lands and relocated to distant parts of the empire, where they could be more easily controlled and where their specialized skills could be put to use. This policy of forced migration served multiple purposes. It prevented rebellions by breaking up ethnic and tribal loyalties. It spread useful technologies and techniques throughout the empire, and it created a cosmopolitan population that was dependent on Assyrian administration for survival. The most defiant rebels faced impalement, a form of execution that was both agonizing and highly visible. Assyrian kings boasted in their inscriptions about the forests of stakes surrounding conquered cities, each topped with the body of a rebel leader. These displays weren't just punishment, they were advertisements, designed to spread word of Assyrian ruthlessness to potential enemies throughout the region. But behind the horror was a machine of brilliance that few ancient civilizations could match. The Assyrian military was supported by an administrative system of remarkable sophistication, capable of coordinating the movements of multiple armies across vast distances, supplying them with weapons and provisions, and integrating conquered territories into the imperial system with remarkable efficiency. Assyria was not just a military empire built on conquest and terror, it was a civilization of remarkable innovation that advanced human knowledge and capability in ways that would influence the ancient world for centuries. Behind the fearsome reputation of Assyrian warriors lay a sophisticated society of engineers, scholars, administrators, and artisans, whose achievements rivaled those of any ancient civilization. The Assyrians were master engineers who transformed the landscape of Mesopotamia through ambitious construction projects that demonstrated both technical skill and organizational capability. They built aqueducts that moved water across vast distances, enabling agriculture in previously barren regions, and supporting large urban populations far from major rivers. The aqueduct at Jerwan, built during the reign of Sennacherib, was a marvel of ancient engineering that carried water across a valley using a series of stone arches, a technique that wouldn't be widely adopted elsewhere for centuries. These water management systems weren't simply they were statements of imperial power and technological superiority. the ability to bring water to the desert, to make gardens bloom in wasteland, was seen as almost divine. Assyrian kings boasted in their inscriptions about their irrigation projects, with the same pride they showed for their military conquests, understanding that the power to control water was as important as the power to control armies. The Assyrians created one of the world's earliest postal systems, a network of roads, way stations, and mounted messengers that could carry information across the empire with unprecedented speed. This communication system was essential for governing an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, but it also facilitated trade, cultural exchange, and the spread of ideas. Messages that would have taken weeks or months to deliver using traditional methods could be transmitted across the empire in days. The postal system was supported by an extensive road network that rivaled anything built by later empires. Assyrian roads were engineered for durability and speed, with stone foundations, drainage systems, and regular maintenance. These roads served military purposes, allowing armies to move quickly to trouble spots, but they also facilitated commerce and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. The Assyrians were meticulous record keepers who documented their history, laws, and administrative procedures on thousands of cuneiform tablets. These records provide modern historians with an incredibly detailed picture of Assyrian society, government, and culture. But more than just historical documents, these tablets represent a sophisticated approach to governance that relied on written law, bureaucratic procedures, and systematic record-keeping. The Assyrian legal system was complex and comprehensive, covering everything from property rights and commercial transactions to criminal law and family relationships. Legal procedures were standardized across the empire, creating a unified system of justice that helped integrate diverse populations under Assyrian rule. The famous Middle Assyrian laws, dating from the 14th century BC, reveal a society that was both hierarchical and surprisingly sophisticated in its approach to legal issues. Their capital city of Nineveh became one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the ancient world, boasting grand palaces, temples, and public buildings that demonstrated Assyrian wealth and power. The city was protected by massive walls that stretched for miles, punctuated by elaborate gates decorated with glazed brick reliefs depicting protective spirits and royal hunts. Within these walls lay an urban landscape of unprecedented grandeur. The royal palaces of Nineveh were architectural marvels that combined functionality with artistic beauty. The palace of Sennacherib covered over 15 acres and contained more than 80 rooms, many decorated with elaborate stone reliefs depicting royal achievements and mythological scenes. These reliefs weren't merely decorative. They were sophisticated works of art that told stories, conveyed political messages, and demonstrated the cultural sophistication of Assyrian civilization. The palace gardens were equally impressive, featuring exotic plants and trees from throughout the empire and beyond. Some scholars believe that the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon were actually located in Nineveh, created by Sennacherib as part of his palace complex. Whether or not this identification is correct, the Gardens of Nineveh were certainly among the wonders of the ancient world, demonstrating Assyrian mastery of hydraulic engineering and botanical knowledge. Most famously, King Ashurbanipal amassed a library of over 30,000 clay tablets that preserved the literary and scholarly heritage of Mesopotamia. This library wasn't simply a collection of documents, it was a systematic attempt to gather and preserve human knowledge. Ashurbanipal sent scribes throughout his empire and beyond to copy important texts, creating the world's first truly comprehensive library. The library contained works in multiple languages and covered an enormous range of subjects: literature, history, law, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and religion. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's earliest great literary works, survives today primarily because of copies preserved in Ashurbanipal's library. The library also contained scientific and technical texts that preserved knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine that would otherwise have been lost. Ashurbanipal's library represents more than just scholarly achievement. It demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of the importance of knowledge and culture in maintaining imperial power. The king understood that controlling information was as important as controlling territory, and that preserving the intellectual heritage of conquered peoples was a way of legitimizing Assyrian rule while ensuring that valuable knowledge wasn't lost. The Assyrians were also skilled artisans and craftsmen who produced works of remarkable beauty and technical sophistication. Assyrian metalwork, particularly in bronze and iron, was renowned throughout the ancient world. Their weapons were not only functional but often beautifully decorated with intricate designs and precious metal inlays. Assyrian jewelry, carved ivory, and glazed ceramics were prized luxury goods that were traded throughout the Mediterranean world. The famous Assyrian reliefs that decorated palace walls represent one of the high points of ancient art. These stone carvings combined artistic skill with narrative sophistication, telling complex stories through carefully composed scenes. The reliefs, depicting royal lion hunts, for example, are not simply records of royal recreation. They are sophisticated allegories about the king's role as protector of his people against the forces of chaos and disorder. Assyrian scholars made significant contributions to astronomy and mathematics, building upon earlier Mesopotamian traditions while adding their own innovations. They developed more accurate calendars, improved methods for predicting eclipses, and created mathematical techniques that would influence later Greek and Islamic scholars. The Assyrian contribution to the development of astrology and astronomy was particularly significant, as their observations and calculations provided the foundation for much later astronomical work. But with every great empire comes the inevitable moment when ambition exceeds capability, when the very success that built the empire becomes the source of its destruction. For Assyria, this moment arrived not through a single catastrophic defeat, but through the gradual accumulation of problems that even their sophisticated administrative system and powerful military could not solve. Assyria expanded too fast, too far, and with too little regard for the long-term consequences of their conquests. By the 7th century BCE, the empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, from the mountains of Armenia to the deserts of Egypt. This vast territory required enormous resources to govern and defend, resources that increasingly strained even Assyria's considerable capabilities. The empire's armies were stretched thin across thousands of miles of frontier, facing threats from multiple directions simultaneously. In the north, the kingdoms of Urartu and various Anatolian peoples posed constant challenges. To the east, the Medes and other Iranian peoples were growing in strength and organization. In the south, Babylon remained a persistent source of rebellion and resistance. To the west, the small kingdoms of the Levant required constant military intervention to maintain control. Each of these frontiers demanded not just military attention, but also administrative resources, diplomatic effort, and economic investment. The Assyrian system of governance, sophisticated as it was, began to show signs of strain under the burden of managing such a vast and diverse empire. Communication delays, administrative inefficiency, and the simple logistics of moving armies and supplies across such distances began to take their toll. The Assyrian policy of ruling through fear, while initially effective, created long-term problems that would eventually prove fatal. Their cruelty bred resentment, not just among conquered peoples, but also among their own subjects, who lived in constant fear of royal displeasure. The systematic deportation of populations, while preventing local rebellions, created an empire filled with displaced, resentful peoples who had no loyalty to Assyrian rule and every reason to support its enemies. The economic burden of maintaining such a large military and administrative apparatus was enormous. Assyrian taxation was heavy and often arbitrary, creating economic hardship throughout the empire. The constant warfare required to maintain control was expensive, and the costs of garrisoning distant territories and suppressing rebellions consumed an ever-increasing share of imperial resources. Perhaps most critically, the Assyrian system of succession was inherently unstable. Unlike some ancient monarchies that developed clear rules for royal succession, Assyria was plagued by succession crises that weakened the empire at crucial moments. Brothers fought brothers for the throne. Civil wars erupted with disturbing regularity, and the energy that should have been devoted to governing the empire was instead consumed by internal power struggles. The reign of Ashurbanipal, despite his cultural achievements, marked the beginning of the end for Assyrian power. His long war with his brother Shamash-shum, who ruled Babylon as a vassal king, devastated both Assyria and Babylonia and demonstrated to the empire's enemies that Assyrian power was not invincible. The civil war lasted for 4 years and required enormous military resources that left other frontiers vulnerable to attack. During this period of internal conflict, Assyria's enemies began to coordinate their efforts in ways that had never been possible before. The Medes, under their king Xerxes, were transforming from a collection of tribal confederations into a unified kingdom capable of challenging Assyrian power. The Babylonians, despite their recent defeat, remained determined to regain their independence and were willing to ally with anyone who could help them achieve this goal. The formation of the Babylonian-Median alliance represented a strategic nightmare for Assyria. For the first time, the empire faced a coordinated threat from 2 major powers simultaneously. The Medes could attack from the east while the Babylonians struck from the south, forcing Assyria to divide its forces and fight on multiple fronts. The alliance was more than just a military partnership. It was a diplomatic revolution that demonstrated how Assyrian brutality had ultimately worked against them. The shared hatred of Assyrian rule created a bond between peoples who had previously been enemies or indifferent to each other's fate. The Medes and Babylonians were joined by other peoples throughout the region, who saw an opportunity to throw off Assyrian domination. The final assault on Assyria began in 614 BCE, when the Medes captured the ancient city of Ashur, the original capital and religious center of the Assyrian Empire. This victory was both practically and symbolically devastating. It cut Assyria off from its historical roots and demonstrated that even the most sacred Assyrian sites were not safe from their enemies. The fall of Ashur was followed by a systematic campaign to destroy Assyrian power throughout the empire. The Allied forces did not simply seek to defeat Assyrian armies. They sought to eliminate Assyria as a political entity entirely. Cities were captured and destroyed, Assyrian administrators were killed or driven out, and the entire imperial structure was systematically dismantled. In 612 BCE, the unthinkable happened. Nineveh, the great capital of the Assyrian Empire, fell to the combined forces of the Babylonians and Medes. The siege was brief but devastating. The city that had been the center of the ancient world's greatest empire was reduced to ruins in a matter of months. The destruction of Nineveh was total and methodical. The great palaces were burned, the massive walls were torn down, and the population was killed or enslaved. The famous library of Ashurbanipal was destroyed, though fortunately many of its tablets survived, buried in the ruins to be discovered by archaeologists in the 19th century. The city that had once housed hundreds of thousands of people was left virtually uninhabited. Fire consumed the wooden structures, Ash covered the ruins, and an eerie silence settled over what had once been the beating heart of an empire. The Assyrian war machine, which had seemed unstoppable for centuries, was gone. The empire that had dominated the ancient world for over 300 years had been destroyed so completely that it would never rise again. The speed and completeness of Assyria's collapse was shocking even to its enemies. Within a few years, an empire that had controlled most of the known world had been reduced to a few scattered remnants hiding in remote fortresses. The last Assyrian king, or Sharubalat, too, attempted to maintain resistance from the city of Haran, but he was defeated and killed in 609 BCE, marking the final end of Assyrian independence. Yet despite its complete political destruction, Assyria left a mark on human civilization that never faded. The empire's influence extended far beyond its military conquests, shaping the development of subsequent civilizations in ways that are still visible today. The Assyrian legacy is complex and multifaceted, encompassing both the innovations that advanced human knowledge and the cautionary lessons about the limits of power built on fear and brutality. The Assyrian approach to warfare profoundly influenced every subsequent empire in the ancient world. The Persians, who inherited much of the former Assyrian territory, adopted and refined many Assyrian military innovations. The Persian army that conquered the Greek city-states used siege techniques, cavalry tactics, and logistical systems that were directly descended from Assyrian models. The famous Persian road system, which enabled rapid communication across their vast empire, was built upon foundations laid by Assyrian engineers. The influence extended westward as well. Greek military theorists studied Assyrian tactics and incorporated many of their innovations into their own military systems. The Macedonian army that Alexander the Great led to conquer the Persian Empire used siege engines and cavalry formations that owed much to Assyrian precedents. The Romans, in turn, learned from both Greek and Persian military traditions, creating their own synthesis that incorporated elements of Assyrian warfare. The Assyrian model of imperial administration was equally influential. Their system of provincial government, with appointed governors responsible to the central authority, became the standard model for ancient empires. The Persian satrap system was directly based on Assyrian administrative practices, and through the Persians, these practices influenced the administrative systems of the Hellenistic kingdoms and eventually the Roman Empire. The Assyrian approach to managing diverse populations within a single political system provided both positive and negative lessons for later empires. Their policy of forced deportation was adopted by the Babylonians and Persians, though usually in less systematic and brutal forms. The Persian policy of cultural tolerance, which allowed conquered peoples to maintain their own customs and religions, can be seen as a direct reaction against Assyria. Brutality, a recognition that empires built on fear alone were ultimately unstable. The preservation of knowledge in Assyrian libraries, particularly the Great Library of Ashurbanipal, had an incalculable impact on human civilization. The texts preserved in Nineveh included not only Assyrian works, but also the literary and scholarly heritage of Babylon and other Mesopotamian civilizations. When these tablets were discovered by archaeologists in the 19th century, they revolutionized our understanding of ancient history and literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's earliest great literary works, survived primarily because of copies in Assyrian libraries. The same is true for numerous other works of Mesopotamian literature, including creation myths, legal codes, and historical chronicles that would otherwise have been lost forever. In preserving these works, the Assyrians performed an invaluable service to human culture. Even if that was not their primary intention, Assyrian contributions to astronomy and mathematics continued to influence scholarly work long after the empire's fall. Their astronomical observations and mathematical techniques were preserved and transmitted by Babylonian scholars, who built upon Assyrian foundations to create even more sophisticated systems. These Babylonian developments, in turn, influenced Greek astronomy and mathematics, creating a chain of intellectual transmission that ultimately contributed to the scientific revolution of the modern era. The artistic legacy of Assyria was equally significant. The great stone reliefs that decorated Assyrian palaces established artistic conventions that influenced art throughout the ancient Near East. The Persians adopted and adapted Assyrian artistic styles for their own palace decorations, and elements of Assyrian art can be traced through various ancient cultures all the way to the Islamic period. The Assyrian approach to urban planning and architecture also left lasting influences. Their techniques for building massive fortifications, organizing urban spaces, and creating impressive public buildings were studied and imitated by later civilizations. The Great Walls of Babylon, built by Nebuchadnezzar II, incorporated engineering techniques developed by Assyrian architects. Perhaps most importantly, Assyria provided a cautionary tale about the limits of power based purely on force and fear. The empire's rapid collapse demonstrated that even the most sophisticated military machine could not indefinitely sustain rule over unwilling subjects. This lesson was not lost on subsequent empire builders, who generally tried to balance coercion with incentives, fear with rewards. The Persian Empire, which rose from the ashes of Assyrian and Babylonian power, explicitly rejected the Assyrian model of rule through terror. Cyrus the Great and his successors portrayed themselves as liberators rather than conquerors, allowing conquered peoples to maintain their own customs and religions while benefiting from Persian protection and trade opportunities. This approach proved far more durable than Assyrian brutality, allowing the Persian Empire to last for over 2 centuries. The Roman Empire, the most successful ancient empire in terms of longevity, also learned from the Assyrian example. While Romans could be ruthless when faced with rebellion, they generally preferred to integrate conquered peoples into their system rather than simply terrorize them into submission. The Roman policy of extending citizenship to conquered peoples, while not universal, created loyalty in ways that Assyrian deportation policies never could. The memory of Assyrian brutality lived on in the cultural consciousness of the ancient world long after the empire's fall. Biblical texts, written during and after the period of Assyrian dominance, portrayed Assyria as the epitome of worldly power corrupted by pride and cruelty. The Book of Nahum celebrates the fall of Nineveh with barely concealed joy, reflecting the widespread relief felt throughout the region when Assyrian power was finally broken. This biblical portrayal of Assyria as a symbol of oppressive worldly power continued to influence Western thought for centuries. Medieval and early modern writers used Assyria as a symbol of tyranny and the inevitable fall of empires built on injustice. The rediscovery of Assyrian ruins in the 19th century added archaeological evidence to these literary traditions, creating a complex legacy that combined admiration for Assyrian achievements with horror at their methods. Modern scholarship has provided a more nuanced view of Assyrian civilization, recognizing both their remarkable achievements and their brutal methods. The Assyrians were neither the one-dimensional monsters portrayed in some ancient sources, nor the purely admirable civilization that some modern scholars have suggested. They were a complex society that combined genuine innovation and cultural achievement with systematic brutality and oppression. The Assyrian legacy reminds us of a powerful truth that remains relevant today: that innovation without compassion, power without justice, and strength without wisdom ultimately lead to destruction. The Assyrians achieved remarkable things. They built one of the ancient world's greatest libraries, created sophisticated administrative systems, and advanced human knowledge in numerous fields. But they also demonstrated that these achievements could not compensate for a system of government based primarily on fear and coercion. So the next time you hear about a lost empire, ask yourself, was it strength that built it, or fear? The Assyrians showed us that even the mightiest civilizations can crumble when they forget that true power comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to build something worth preserving. Their libraries outlasted their armies. Their innovations survived their conquests. And their story continues to teach us that the greatest empires are remembered not for whom they defeated, but for what they contributed to the long journey of human civilization. And remember, stories survive where swords do not. The clay tablets of Ashurbanipal's library still speak to us across the millennia, while the bronze weapons of Assyrian warriors have long since turned to dust. In the end, it is knowledge, not conquest, that achieves true immortality. Like, share, and subscribe, because I'll Tell You What Happened has more ancient echoes to uncover, more forgotten civilizations to remember, and more lessons from the past to illuminate our present.